first crisis, that of Tiananmen Square in 1989. What's clear from the record is President Bush ran U.S.-China policy, both during the crisis and before and after. He had an extensive background with China. He was the head of the first U.S. liaison office in Beijing. When he was head of the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Vice President. Throughout this period, we were interacting very closely with China. There was a lot of cooperation in, say, Afghanistan, or monitoring what was happening in terms of Soviet military developments. And the President managed to develop good relations with many Chinese leaders. And as the Secretary of State, James Baker, said, in the case of China policy, it's fair to say that very few policy initiatives were generated either by state or the National Security Council during my tenure. There really was no need, meaning the President himself made his own policies, though he listened to his advisors, of course. The President came in with a fairly traditional realpolitik view of how you approach relations with China. And this is a continuation of maybe what you saw during the Kissinger administration. In this framework, you obviously like to see China evolve into a political democracy. You'd like to see them pursue free market economics. You'd like them to treat the people well. But you have to recognize there are limits on American power. It's difficult to tell another country how they play internally. Therefore, it makes sense to try and focus directly on influencing their foreign behavior. What policies China, say, is pursuing towards Russia, what policies it's doing towards Taiwan, and then rely on history and your faith in a triumph of political liberalism and free market to eventually cause the political system in China to evolve. The problem the President was running into was by 1989 and that period, we were seeing a whole series of waves. So we had what's known as the third wave of democracy expansion. You had the Soviet Empire was falling apart, Eastern Europe, Warsaw Pact. There was an expectation that you were going to see this surge of democracy throughout the world. And when the protests and disturbances started in China, people naturally thought, well, we're going to see that there too. And when it didn't take place, and we still see this today, there's a residue of disappointment. I mean, we still would very much like to see China into liberal democracy, and it's still our expectation that it at some point is going to happen based on our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between economic development and political liberalization. But the fact that it hasn't occurred, it manifests most seriously in terms of the Bush administration, where we saw that tension between basically shattered expectations. Just to remind people what was happening in China at this time, Mao died in 1976. Afterwards, there was this very complex transition in which it was going from a very much Stalinist type of totalitarian state into this uneasy mixture of a more authoritarian political regime. It had state capitalism, elements of free market practices. It was opening up economically. But it's not unnatural, it's not unsurprising that you saw these series of crises occurring with China. And there were these mass protests in 1979, 1986, and 1989. In 1989, what happened is April of that year, a very popular political reformer died, and the funeral served as an occasion for initially some discontented students to denounce various policies that they disliked about the ruling Communist Party. And these criticisms, there were some were political, want more democracy, some were just against corruption or other arbitrary practices, and it resonated very strongly with much of the Chinese population at the time. So the number of protests has just surged massively. You had intellectuals, you had student leaders, you had workers join in. We ended up with about 1 million people in mid-May in Tiananmen Square protesting for something. Probably some wanted democracy, some wanted something else. But the government had never seen anything like this, and so they're initially paralyzed. But by about June, however, the hardliners had seized control of the political decision-making process. They had those people who wanted to, say, negotiate with the student leaders further. And they decided to have the regular military forces go in, and basically they had several days of very severe killing. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people died. We just don't know what was happening in Beijing, let alone the provinces. And this whole affair caught everyone off guard in the U.S. national security system. Political leaders, career diplomats, intelligence analysts, this was not really something expected. In addition, we had this transition problem. As the Bush administration was trying to deal with this, a very complex moment, was trying to deal with the evolution of Gorbachev, this late Gorbachev period. He was opening up the system. There were problems with the Soviet Union. They were trying to manage that. Gorbachev was just happening to be in China at this time, and so there was a concerned about maybe the Chinese would move towards Russia, the Soviet Union then. And so this crisis just caught everyone off guard. And the initial response, which carried over in the initial, even after the repression, the Bush administration said, well, the president said, I deeply deplore what's happened, and we want to call everyone to get back together and go to return to nonviolent means, pursue dialogue. Secretary Baker said that there had been some violence used on both sides, so we need to be careful, we need to assess the situation before deciding what kind of policies to pursue. And this just ran very much counter to what we were seeing in the American public and Congress. There was this mass outrage, call for sanctions, call for other actions. And you had this continuing dynamic throughout this period, starting with Tiananmen and continuing on, in which Congress basically changed its views towards China. During the 1980s, it shared the general consensus you saw in the Carter, under Brzezinski, and the Reagan administrations that China was a useful ally, or at least in alignment with U.S. goals in countering the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union looked very strong in the 1980s. China was seen as aligned with us to kind of counterbalance Soviet influence. And then when the Soviet bloc collapsed, you basically saw a collapse of this consensus, and if anything, there was a rise of this anti-Beijing coalition, which linked together liberals in Congress and in society at large, concerned about human rights practices. You had conservatives concerned about the fact that Beijing was so communist, running the communist government, concerned about security of Taiwan. You had special interests concerned about many special interests, not less ideologically, but concerned about unfair commercial practices, the espionage operations that Michelle mentioned. There was evidence that elements within the Chinese government proliferating missiles and weapons of mass destruction to Korea, Pakistan, other governments we were concerned about. So the president responded initially by adopting a set of limited sanctions, which was recommended by the interagency, primarily focused on curtailing ties with the Chinese military, since they were seen as most involved in the repression. It just didn't fly in the public. Congress kept on pushing for harder actions. The president's response was, he was quite open about this. He said, I'm the president, I set foreign policy objectives and actions. I think they know, most people in Congress, that I not only have keen personal interest in China, but I understand reasonably well what we should do. Well, that wasn't the case, and that's not been the case since. The president has to be able to deal with Congress and to get a policy towards China that's accepted. And so you had a struggle over what sanctions to adopt. The president kept trying to water them down, veto them. You had people working out various deals. The main problem, though, the president realized that this wasn't a very productive enterprise, and so he kept on trying to press the Chinese leadership to give him some maneuvering room. I mean, and the most famous episode, of course, is when he circumvented the entire bureaucracy. He felt he had to, and just sent National Security Subscriber Scowcroft and Undersecretary of State Eagleberger on a secret mission to China, even though one of the sanctions he himself had adopted was there wouldn't be these type of high-level exchanges with the Chinese leadership. And they basically told the Chinese, the president wants to retain the relationship with China, and understands strategic important, but you really have to lessen domestic repression because it's just not something that Congress and the American people will accept. And so he's basically asking them to help reduce this dilemma. And it never worked. The Chinese, they would sometimes make gestures to free some people, but perhaps because of the nature of the political system, perhaps because they saw what was happening with Gorbachev losing power, particularly they saw what happened with Ceausescu in Romania when the government lost power. The first thing they did was shot the old leader. So they were very reluctant to give up power at that point. And so you basically saw the deterioration in relations to the United States and China, which by the time of the Belgrade bombing really had